Evangelical pastor vanished in a rural area. In 1982, 26 years later, his Bible is found in a well. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned Hartwell farm as construction worker Miguel Santos adjusted his hard hat and wiped sweat from his forehead. The well renovation project had been routine until his shovel struck something unexpected 15 feet down, something that wasn't supposed to be there. "Hey, Tommy," Miguel called to his supervisor, his voice echoing up from the depths of the old stone well. "You need to see this." Thomas Mackenzie, a weathered man in his 50s who had overseen dozens of rural construction projects, approached the well's edge with casual curiosity. What he saw in Miguel's dirt-covered hands made his blood run cold. A leather-bound Bible, its pages swollen with decades of moisture, emerged from the earth like a testament to forgotten prayers. The gold lettering on the cover, though faded, was still legible. "Property of Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield." "Dear Lord," Tommy whispered, recognition dawning in his eyes. That's the pastor who disappeared back in '82. Miguel climbed out of the well, cradling the waterlogged book with surprising reverence. "You knew him?" Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew Pastor Whitfield. He was the shepherd of Trinity Baptist Church for nearly 20 years. One day he just vanished, left behind a wife and 2 kids. Tommy's voice carried the weight of old mysteries. The police searched everywhere, never found a trace. The Bible's pages had fused together in places, but the inscription on the inside cover remained clear. "To my beloved husband, with all my love, Sarah, Christmas 1978. Below that in different handwriting, may God's word guide your path always. J.W." By noon, the Cedar Ridge Police Department had cordoned off the construction site. Detective Maria Rodriguez, a sharp-eyed woman who had transferred from Nashville just 3 years prior, examined the Bible with latex gloves, while crime scene photographers documented every angle. 26 years, she muttered, more to herself than to the assembled officers. "This book has been down there for 26 years. Deputy Chief Harold Brennan, a Cedar Ridge native who had been a rookie officer when Pastor Whitfield disappeared, stood nearby with his arms crossed. "Maria, you weren't here back then. This case tore the community apart. We searched for months. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers combing every inch of the county. But nobody thought to check the old wells," Rodriguez observed, her tone carrying a hint of criticism. "The Hartwell farm was searched. The family said they checked the well. It was boarded up, had been for years. Besides, why would Pastor Whitfield be way out here? This place is 5 miles from the church, 8 miles from his house." Detective Rodriguez carefully turned the Bible over in her hands. Despite the water damage, the leather binding remained intact. More importantly, there were no obvious signs of violence, no bloodstains, no tears that would indicate a struggle. "We need to contact the family," she said finally. "Sarah Whitfield, is she still in the area?" "She moved to Knoxville about 10 years ago. Remarried. Goes by Sarah Coleman now. But the kid, Benjamin, would be in his 30s now and Rebecca about 28. They both stayed local." As the afternoon wore on, more residents gathered along the police perimeter. News traveled fast in small towns, and the discovery of Pastor Whitfield's Bible had awakened memories that many had tried to bury. Eleanor Haskins, now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, stood among the crowd. She had been the church secretary for 40 years, serving under 3 different pastors. "I remember the day he disappeared like it was yesterday," she told anyone who would listen. Sunday morning, May 16, 1982, he was supposed to give the morning sermon, but he never showed up. First time in 20 years he'd missed a service without calling ahead. The current pastor of Trinity Baptist, Reverend Marcus Thompson, arrived at the scene in his pickup truck. A tall, imposing man with prematurely gray hair, he had taken over the congregation in 1985, 3 years after Whitfield's disappearance. "This is unexpected," he said to Detective Rodriguez, his voice carefully controlled. "Pastor Whitfield was a pillar of this community. His disappearance left wounds that never fully healed." "Did you know him personally?" Rodriguez asked, studying Thompson's reaction. "I was just a young seminary student then, visiting from Nashville. I attended a few of his services. Powerful preacher, devoted family man. That's what made his disappearance so shocking." As evening approached, the crime scene team expanded their search around the well. Metal detectors swept the area, while cadaver dogs were brought in from the state crime lab. The Bible was carefully packaged and sent to the forensics laboratory for detailed analysis. Benjamin Whitfield received the call at his auto repair shop on Main Street. At 34, he bore a strong resemblance to his father, the same penetrating blue eyes, the same firm jawline. But where his father had been known for his gentle demeanor, Ben carried himself with the hardened posture of a man who had learned not to trust easily. "They found his Bible," he told his sister Rebecca when she arrived at the shop 20 minutes later, "in the old Hartwell well." Rebecca, now a kindergarten teacher at Cedar Ridge Elementary, sank into a chair beside her brother's desk. "After all these years, and what does it mean?" "It means someone put it there," Ben said grimly. "Dad didn't just wander off and fall into a well. Someone wanted us to think he had." The siblings had spent their adult lives wrestling with their father's disappearance. The official investigation had concluded that Pastor Whitfield had likely suffered some form of mental breakdown and either committed suicide or started a new life elsewhere. Neither Ben nor Rebecca had ever accepted that explanation. "He wouldn't have just left us," Rebecca said, echoing arguments they had made countless times over the years. "Dad loved us, loved the church. He would have found a way to say goodbye." That night, Detective Rodriguez sat in her office reviewing the original case files. The investigation had been thorough for a small-town police force, but she noticed gaps that reflected the limitations of 1982 technology and forensic capabilities. Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield had been 52 years old when he vanished, married to Sarah for 25 years, father to Benjamin, 8, and Rebecca, 2. He had pastored Trinity Baptist Church since 1963, building it from a small congregation of 30 families to over 200 members. By all accounts, he was beloved by his parishioners and respected throughout the community. The last confirmed sighting had been Saturday evening, May 15, 1982. Pastor Whitfield had been seen leaving the church around 8 p.m. after preparing his Sunday sermon. His car, a 1979 Ford station wagon, was found the next morning in the church parking lot, keys still in the ignition. What troubled Rodriguez most was the lack of a clear motive for disappearance. Pastor Whitfield had no known enemies, no financial troubles, no history of mental illness. The church finances were clean, his marriage appeared stable, and his children adored him. "Something spooked him," she said aloud, studying a photograph of the pastor taken just weeks before his disappearance. Or someone did. The Bible's discovery had reopened old wounds, but it had also provided the first real evidence in 26 years. Detective Rodriguez was determined to find out why Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield's most precious possession had ended up at the bottom of a well, and more importantly, what had happened to the man who carried it. As she locked the case files away for the night, Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that the truth about Pastor Whitfield's disappearance was still buried somewhere in Cedar Ridge, and that someone in this tight-knit community knew exactly what had happened on that long-ago May evening. The forensics report arrived on Detective Rodriguez's desk at 7:30 a.m., delivered by courier from the State Crime Lab in Nashville. She spread the documents across her desk while Deputy Chief Brennan poured coffee from the station's perpetually brewing pot. "DNA analysis confirms it," Rodriguez announced, scanning the technical language. "The Bible definitely belonged to Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield. They found his fingerprints on 12 different pages, plus hair follicles trapped in the binding." Brennan settled into a chair across from her desk. Hair follicles after 26 years underwater. The leather binding created a sealed environment. Plus, the well water was surprisingly clean, minimal bacterial contamination. Rodriguez turned to the next page. "But here's the interesting part. They found 2 sets of fingerprints on the Bible. The wife's? No. Sarah Whitfield's prints aren't in the system, but these secondary prints belong to someone else entirely. Someone who handled the Bible extensively." Brennan leaned forward. "Any matches? That's what we need to find out. I'm running them through APHIS now, but I want to start with the people who would have had legitimate reasons to handle Pastor Whitfield's Bible." Their first stop was Trinity Baptist Church, a modest white building with a tall steeple that dominated the town's skyline. The church sat on 2 acres of well-maintained grounds, with a small cemetery dating back to the 1800s behind the main building. Reverend Marcus Thompson met them at the front entrance, his expression grave. "I've been expecting you," he said, unlocking the heavy wooden doors. "The news about the Bible has spread through the congregation like wildfire." Inside, the church retained its traditional design. Wooden pews arranged in neat rows, stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes, and a raised pulpit where generations of pastors had delivered sermons. A portrait of Pastor Whitfield hung in the vestibule, showing a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Tell me about the transition period," Rodriguez requested as they walked down the center aisle. "When Pastor Whitfield disappeared, what happened to his personal effects?" Thompson paused at the front pew. "It was chaos, honestly. The church board didn't know what to do. Pastor Whitfield's office was sealed for the police investigation, but after a few months they had to make decisions about moving forward. Who handled his belongings? The church board, mainly. Deacon William Hartwell was the head of the board then. He oversaw packing up the pastor's office, deciding what to keep and what to return to the family." Rodriguez exchanged glances with Brennan. "Hartwell, as in the Hartwell farm where the Bible was found?" "Yes, William owned that property. He was one of the founding families of the church, very influential in the community." Thompson's voice carried a note of respect. "William passed away in 1995, but his son David still lives in town." They spent the next hour examining Pastor Whitfield's former office, now used for storage. The room was sparse but functional, with built-in bookshelves and a large desk facing a window that looked out over the cemetery. "The police took everything initially," Thompson explained, "but they returned most of it within 6 months. The family got his personal items, but the church kept his theological books and files." Rodriguez opened several filing cabinets, finding them filled with sermon notes, church correspondence, and financial records. What about his preparation routine? How did he work on his sermons? According to the older members, Pastor Whitfield was very methodical. He spent hours studying, always with his Bible open. He made extensive notes in the margins, cross-referenced passages. That Bible was his primary tool. Eleanor Haskins arrived at the church while they were still investigating. The former church secretary moved with the careful steps of someone who had learned to navigate the world with failing eyesight, but her memory remained sharp. "I worked with Pastor Whitfield for 18 years, she said, settling into a chair in the church office. "He was a creature of habit. Every Saturday evening he would lock himself in his office to put the finishing touches on his Sunday sermon. He never left without that Bible." "You're certain he had it with him that last Saturday?" Rodriguez asked. "Absolutely. I saw him leave through the side door around 8 o'clock. He called out, 'Good night, Eleanor,' like he always did. He was carrying his Bible and his sermon notes." Deputy Chief Brennan pulled out a notebook. "Eleanor, in all those years, did Pastor Whitfield ever mention feeling threatened? Anyone who might have wished him harm?" The elderly woman's face clouded. "There were tensions. Not everyone approved of some of his positions." "What kind of positions?" "Pastor Whitfield was progressive for his time, especially on social issues. He supported the civil rights movement, welcomed black families into the congregation when other churches in the area were resistant. He also spoke out against the Vietnam War, which didn't sit well with some members." Rodriguez leaned forward. "Were there specific individuals who opposed him?" Eleanor hesitated. "Deacon Hartwell and Pastor Whitfield disagreed on several issues. William believed the church should stay out of politics entirely. He thought the pastor's sermons were becoming too worldly." "How serious were these disagreements?" "Serious enough that William called for a church board meeting in April 1982, just a month before Pastor Whitfield disappeared. He wanted to discuss the pastor's future with the congregation. This was the first indication Rodriguez had heard of any conflict within the church." "What happened at that meeting?" "The board voted to support Pastor Whitfield, but it was close. William wasn't happy about it. After leaving the church, Rodriguez and Brennan drove to the Hartwell property. The old farmhouse sat on 50 acres of rolling hills, with the infamous well located about a quarter-mile from the main buildings. David Hartwell, now in his 60s, met them at the front door. "I heard about the Bible," he said before they could introduce themselves. "My father would be rolling over in his grave." David bore a strong resemblance to his late father, tall, broad-shouldered, with the weathered hands of a man who had worked the land his entire life. He invited them into a living room filled with antique furniture and family photographs. "Tell us about your father's relationship with Pastor Whitfield," Rodriguez requested. David's expression darkened. They had their differences. Dad was old school, believed in keeping religion and politics separate. He thought Pastor Whitfield was leading the church astray. Astray how? The integration issue was a big one. Dad wasn't necessarily against black folks, but he believed in tradition. He thought the church should focus on salvation, not social reform. Brennan consulted his notes. "Your father was on the church board." "Head of the board for 12 years. He took that responsibility seriously. When he felt the pastor was making mistakes, he said so. Mistakes like what? David shifted uncomfortably. There were rumors about Pastor Whitfield's personal life. Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken. What kind of rumors? Nothing concrete. But Dad heard things. Whispers about the pastor spending too much time counseling young women, being too familiar with certain members of the congregation. Did your father believe these rumors? He was concerned enough to investigate. Dad was a careful man, methodical. He didn't make accusations lightly. The conversation continued for another hour, with David revealing more about the tension between his father and the missing pastor. According to David, William Hartwell had been compiling information about Pastor Whitfield's conduct, planning to present it to the church board if necessary. What happened to this information after Pastor Whitfield disappeared? Rodriguez asked. Dad destroyed it, said there was no point in tarnishing a dead man's reputation. As they prepared to leave, Rodriguez asked about the well where the Bible had been found. David explained that it had been boarded up since the 1970s after a farm accident nearly killed a neighbor's child. Nobody used that well for anything, he insisted. It was dangerous, unstable. We posted warning signs and kept it covered. Driving back to town, Rodriguez and Brennan processed what they had learned. The picture of Pastor Whitfield as a universally beloved community leader was beginning to show cracks. We need to talk to more people from that time period, Rodriguez said. Find out what really happened in those weeks before the disappearance. You think William Hartwell might have been involved? I think William Hartwell knew something, and somehow Pastor Whitfield's Bible ended up in his well. That evening, Rodriguez called Sarah Coleman, the pastor's widow, who agreed to meet with them the following day. As she prepared for the interview, Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that they were only beginning to uncover the truth about what had happened to Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield. The discovery of the Bible had opened a door that had been closed for 26 years. Now Rodriguez needed to find out who had closed it and why. Sarah Coleman's home in Knoxville was a modest ranch-style house with a well-tended garden and a swing set in the backyard, evidence of her second marriage and the grandchildren who visited regularly. At 67, she retained the dignified bearing of a pastor's wife, though her eyes carried the weight of decades-old grief. I've been dreading this day for 26 years, she said, serving coffee to Detective Rodriguez and Deputy Chief Brennan in her living room. Part of me always knew the truth would surface eventually. Rodriguez studied Sarah's face carefully. What truth is that, Mrs. Coleman? That someone killed my husband, that he didn't just walk away from his family and his calling. Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. Jeremiah would never have abandoned his Bible. It was his most precious possession. She led them to a spare bedroom that had been converted into a study. The walls were lined with photographs of their life together, their wedding day, the children's baptisms, church events, and family vacations. A framed photo of Pastor Whitfield preaching from the pulpit held a place of honor on the desk. The police asked me the same questions over and over, Sarah continued. Was Jeremiah depressed? Was our marriage troubled? Did he have enemies? I told them then what I'm telling you now. My husband was a man of God who loved his family and his congregation. Brennan pulled out a recording device. Mrs. Coleman, we need to ask about some specific issues that have come to light. There were apparently some tensions within the church in the months before Jeremiah's disappearance. Sarah's expression hardened. William Hartwell. You knew about the conflicts? Of course I knew. William made his displeasure known to anyone who would listen. He thought Jeremiah was too progressive, too willing to challenge the status quo. Rodriguez leaned forward. What specific issues caused the conflicts? Integration, primarily. When the Morrison family wanted to join the church in 1981, William opposed it. He said it would cause division in the congregation, drive away long-time members. Jeremiah welcomed them with open arms. Were there other issues? Sarah hesitated. William spread rumors, cruel, baseless rumors about Jeremiah's counseling sessions with parishioners. He implied that there was something inappropriate happening. What kind of rumors? That Jeremiah was having an affair with one of the young women in the congregation. It was complete nonsense, but William used it to try to undermine Jeremiah's authority. Rodriguez made notes while Sarah continued. The rumor centered around a young woman named Patricia Mills. She was going through a difficult divorce, and Jeremiah was providing pastoral counseling. William somehow twisted that into something sordid. Where is Patricia Mills now? She moved away not long after Jeremiah disappeared. I heard she remarried and lives somewhere in Georgia. The interview continued for 2 hours, with Sarah providing detailed accounts of the final weeks of her husband's life. She described a man under increasing pressure, but committed to his principles and his congregation. The Thursday before he disappeared, Jeremiah came home very troubled, Sarah recalled. He said William had approached him after the board meeting with what he called evidence of misconduct. What kind of evidence? Jeremiah wouldn't tell me specifics. He just said it was fabricated nonsense, photographs taken out of context, testimony from unreliable sources. He was planning to address it head-on at the next board meeting. Rodriguez felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. When was the next board meeting scheduled? Monday, May 17th, the day after Jeremiah disappeared. On the drive back to Cedar Ridge, Rodriguez called the state crime lab to check on additional forensic analysis of the Bible. The technician confirmed that they had found traces of mud and organic material consistent with the well environment, but also something unexpected. There are traces of motor oil on the leather binding, the technician reported. Fresh when the Bible was submerged but degraded over time. Motor oil. Yes, the chemical signature suggests it came from a vehicle, probably dripped onto the Bible before it went into the well. Rodriguez exchanged glances with Brennan. Can you determine what type of vehicle? The oil is consistent with 1970s or early 1980s American-made trucks or heavy equipment. We can narrow it down further with additional testing. Back in Cedar Ridge, they stopped at the county clerk's office to review property records and vehicle registrations from 1982. The clerk, a helpful woman named Janet Morrison, pulled the relevant files from storage. The Hartwell family owned several vehicles in 1982, she reported. William had a 1979 Ford pickup truck, and the farm also had a 1976 International Harvester tractor. Rodriguez studied the registration documents. Both vehicles would have used the type of motor oil found on the Bible. Their next stop was the Cedar Ridge Cemetery, where Pastor Whitfield's memorial stone stood in the church section. The stone, erected in 1990, bore the inscription, Jeremiah Whitfield, 1930-1982, beloved pastor and father, well done, good and faithful servant. They had to declare him dead eventually, Brennan explained. 7 years after the disappearance, the family held a memorial service. As they stood before the empty grave, Rodriguez noticed another headstone nearby. William Hartwell, 1925-1995, faithful servant of God and community. The proximity of the two stones seemed symbolic of the conflict that had defined their relationship. That evening, Rodriguez visited the Cedar Ridge Public Library to research local newspapers from 1982. The librarian, a young woman named Michelle Torres, helped her access the archived copies of the Cedar Ridge Gazette. The newspaper coverage of Pastor Whitfield's disappearance was extensive. The front page of the May 20th, 1982 edition carried the headline, Beloved Pastor, Vanishes without trace. The article described the search efforts and included quotes from church members expressing shock and concern, but it was a letter to the editor published 3 weeks later that caught Rodriguez's attention. The letter, signed by a concerned congregant, raised questions about the pastor's recent behavior and suggested that his disappearance might not be entirely mysterious. Someone wanted to plant seeds of doubt, Rodriguez muttered, photographing the letter with her phone. The final piece of the day's investigation came from an unexpected source. Eleanor Haskins called Rodriguez at home that evening, her voice excited but cautious. I've been going through some old files, Eleanor said. Church records from 1982. I found something you need to see. They arranged to meet at Eleanor's house the next morning. Rodriguez ended the call with a growing sense that they were approaching a breakthrough in the case. That night, she spread all the evidence across her dining room table. Forensic reports, witness statements, newspaper clippings, and photographs. The pattern was becoming clearer. Pastor Whitfield had been under attack in the weeks before his disappearance, his reputation systematically undermined by someone who wanted him gone. The Bible's discovery had done more than provide physical evidence. It had revealed the existence of a conspiracy that had remained hidden for 26 years. Rodriguez was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried in the secrets of Cedar Ridge. Eleanor Haskins' living room was a shrine to her decades of service to Trinity Baptist Church. Photographs of church events, certificates of appreciation, and religious memorabilia covered every surface. At 81, she moved slowly but deliberately, her mind sharp despite her failing eyesight. I kept copies of everything. she explained to Detective Rodriguez and Deputy Chief Brennan, gesturing to several cardboard boxes stacked near her armchair. The church board meetings, correspondence, financial records. I always believed someone would need them someday. She pulled out a manila folder labeled Board Meeting Minutes, 1982, and handed it to Rodriguez. I found this last night, the meeting from April 15, 1982, the one where William Hartwell presented his accusations. Rodriguez opened the folder and began reading. The minutes were meticulously typed, recording every motion and vote, but it was the section labeled New Business that made her pulse quicken. Deacon Hartwell presented concerns regarding Pastor Whitfield's conduct, she read aloud. He submitted photographic evidence and witness statements, suggesting inappropriate relationships with female parishioners. The board voted to table the matter pending further investigation. Eleanor nodded grimly. William had been building a case for months. He claimed to have proof that Pastor Whitfield was compromising his ministry. What kind of proof? Photographs of the pastor meeting with Patricia Mills at various locations around town. Testimony from people who claimed to have seen them together in compromising situations. It was all circumstantial, but William presented it as if it were definitive. Brennan examined the minutes. Who else was on the board? 7 members total. William Hartwell, Robert Chen, Martha Stevens, Frank Morrison, Helen Burke, Thomas Wright, and Samuel Adams. Most of them are deceased now, but Robert Chen and Martha Stevens are still alive. Rodriguez made notes. What was the board's reaction to Hartwell's accusations? Divided. Robert Chen and Martha Stevens defended Pastor Whitfield immediately. They said the accusations were baseless and motivated by personal animosity. Frank Morrison and Helen Burke seemed unsure. Thomas Wright and Samuel Adams sided with William. 3 against 3 with William as the 7th vote? Exactly. That's why they tabled the matter. William demanded a formal investigation, but the others insisted on giving Pastor Whitfield a chance to respond. Eleanor pulled out another document, a handwritten letter dated May 10, 1982. This arrived at my home 6 days before Pastor Whitfield disappeared. I never showed it to anyone. The letter was written in block letters, obviously disguised handwriting. Your pastor is a fraud and a sinner. He will be exposed soon. The truth cannot be hidden forever. Rodriguez examined the letter carefully. Why didn't you report this to the police? I was frightened. After Pastor Whitfield disappeared, I convinced myself it was just a crank letter. But now, with the Bible being found on the Hartwell property, you think William Hartwell sent this? Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. I think William Hartwell did more than send letters. The investigation team's next stop was the home of Robert Chen, now 78 and living in a retirement community on the outskirts of town. Chen, a retired accountant who had managed the church's finances for 20 years, agreed to meet them in the community center. William Hartwell was obsessed with destroying Pastor Whitfield, Chen said without preamble. He spent months collecting gossip, taking photographs, interviewing anyone who might have something negative to say. Why? Rodriguez asked. What motivated such intense opposition? Power and control. William had been the most influential member of the congregation for decades. Pastor Whitfield's progressive positions threatened that influence. The integration issue was the final straw. Chen pulled out a briefcase containing his own records from the church board. I kept these in case they were ever needed. William's accusations were detailed and specific, but they were also fabricated. You're certain they were false? Absolutely. I did my own investigation. The photographs William presented were taken out of context. Pastor Whitfield meeting with Patricia Mills at the church, at the hospital when her mother was dying, at the courthouse when she was filing for divorce. All legitimate pastoral duties. Rodriguez studied the photos Chen had kept. They showed Pastor Whitfield and Patricia Mills in various locations, but none suggested anything inappropriate. What about the witness statements? Most came from people who had their own grievances against the pastor. William coached them, suggested what they should say. It was a coordinated campaign to destroy Pastor Whitfield's reputation. Brennan leaned forward. Did you share these concerns with the other board members? I tried to, but William was very persuasive. He presented himself as a reluctant accuser, someone who was only doing his duty to protect the church. Some board members were swayed by his apparent sincerity. What happened at the final board meeting scheduled for May 17th? Chen's face darkened. There was no meeting. William called it off, claiming that Pastor Whitfield's disappearance proved his guilt. He said the pastor had fled rather than face the accusations. The picture was becoming clearer. But Rodriguez needed more evidence. That afternoon, she and Brennan drove to the home of Martha Stevens, the other surviving board member who had supported Pastor Whitfield. Martha, now 85 and living with her daughter, was confined to a wheelchair but mentally alert. She received them in her sunny living room, surrounded by family photographs and religious artwork. "I've been waiting for this day for 26 years, Martha said, her voice still strong despite her age. "William Hartwell murdered Pastor Whitfield. I've always believed that." Rodriguez sat forward. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Stevens." "It's the truth. William was consumed with hatred for Pastor Whitfield. He couldn't stand that the congregation chose to follow a man who preached love and acceptance over fear and division. Tell us about the final weeks before the disappearance." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "William was like a man possessed. He followed Pastor Whitfield around town, taking photographs, trying to catch him in compromising situations. He recruited others to spy on the pastor, to report back on his activities. Who else was involved? His son David helped sometimes, and there were others, people who resented Pastor Whitfield's positions on civil rights, Vietnam, social justice. William gave them a focus for their hatred." Rodriguez showed Martha the anonymous letter Eleanor had received. "Do you recognize this handwriting? It could be William's. He was left-handed, and he sometimes wrote in block letters when he wanted to disguise his handwriting. Mrs. Stevens, do you have any direct evidence that William Hartwell was involved in Pastor Whitfield's disappearance?" Martha hesitated for a long moment. "The Saturday night before Pastor Whitfield disappeared, I couldn't sleep. I went for a walk around 11 o'clock. I lived only 3 blocks from the church then. I saw William's truck parked behind the church building." "Are you certain it was his truck?" "I knew that truck. It had a distinctive dent in the left rear fender from when William hit a deer. The truck was there when I passed by at 11, and it was still there when I walked back 20 minutes later." This was the first direct evidence linking William Hartwell to the night of Pastor Whitfield's disappearance. Rodriguez felt the case beginning to solidify. "Did you report this to the police?" "I mentioned it during the initial investigation, but they said William claimed he was at home all evening. His wife supported his alibi." "His wife?" "Agnes Hartwell. She died in 1989, but she always backed up William's stories. She was completely devoted to him." As the interview concluded, Rodriguez realized they had uncovered a conspiracy that went far deeper than simple church politics. William Hartwell had orchestrated a systematic campaign to destroy Pastor Whitfield, and when that campaign failed to achieve its goal, he had taken more drastic action. That evening, Rodriguez and Brennan returned to the Hartwell property to re-examine the well where the Bible had been found. The crime scene tape was still in place and the construction equipment remained idle. "If William Hartwell killed Pastor Whitfield," Brennan said, standing at the edge of the well, "why dump the Bible here but not the body?" Rodriguez studied the surrounding area. "Maybe he was interrupted, or maybe he disposed of the body somewhere else and kept the Bible as a trophy. Or maybe," she added, looking toward the old farmhouse, "the body is still here somewhere and we just haven't found it yet." As darkness fell over the Hartwell property, Rodriguez made a decision that would change the course of the investigation. She would request a full forensic excavation of the property, including ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. 26 years after Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield's disappearance, the truth was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows where it had been hidden for so long. The forensic excavation of the Hartwell property began at dawn. 2 teams of experts arrived from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, bringing ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and excavation equipment. Detective Rodriguez watched from the command post as they methodically searched the 50-acre property. David Hartwell stood on his front porch, arms crossed, watching the invasion of his family's land with barely concealed anger. When Rodriguez approached him, his hostility was immediate and intense. "You're destroying my father's reputation based on gossip and coincidence," he said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Dad was a pillar of this community. He would never have harmed anyone." "Then help us prove that," Rodriguez replied calmly. "Tell us what you know about the night Pastor Whitfield disappeared." David's jaw tightened. "I was 16 years old. I was home doing homework. Dad was there too, watching television with Mom. Martha Stevens saw your father's truck behind the church that night. Martha Stevens was a senile old woman even then. She couldn't tell the difference between a truck and a tractor." Rodriguez pulled out a photograph from the original police file. "This is your father's truck from 1982. The dent in the left rear fender is clearly visible. Mrs. Stevens described that exact dent. David stared at the photograph for a long moment. Maybe Dad drove by the church to check on something. That doesn't mean he killed anyone. What would he need to check on at 11 o'clock at night? I don't know. But Dad was a responsible man. If he saw something suspicious, he would have investigated. The conversation was interrupted by shouting from the excavation team. One of the cadaver dogs had alerted near an old barn foundation about 200 yards from the well. Rodriguez hurried to the site where team leader Dr. Sandra Walsh was examining the ground with a metal detector. "We've got something," Dr. Walsh announced. "The dog's indicating human remains, and the ground-penetrating radar shows an anomaly about 4 feet down." Rodriguez felt her heart rate increase. "How old?" "Based on the soil composition and the dog's behavior, I'd estimate 20 to 30 years. We need to excavate carefully to preserve any evidence." The excavation took 3 hours. Working with brushes and small hand tools, the team gradually uncovered what appeared to be a makeshift grave. But instead of human remains, they found a collection of personal items wrapped in a deteriorating tarp. "Clothes," Dr. Walsh announced, lifting each item carefully. A man's suit, white shirt, tie and dress shoes, all consistent with 1980s fashion. Rodriguez examined the clothing. The suit was navy blue, well tailored, and showed signs of having been worn regularly. The shirt was white cotton with a subtle pattern, and the tie was dark blue with small gold crosses. "Pastor's clothes," she said with certainty. These are the clothes he would have worn for Sunday services. But the most significant discovery was at the bottom of the cache, a leather portfolio containing sermon notes, church correspondence, and personal papers. The portfolio was embossed with the initials JW and showed signs of water damage. "Someone buried these items separately from the body," Dr. Walsh observed. "That suggests either panic or a deliberate attempt to dispose of evidence piecemeal." Rodriguez studied the scene carefully. The grave site was positioned to be invisible from the house, but easily accessible by vehicle. Someone familiar with the property had chosen this location deliberately. David Hartwell's composure finally cracked when he saw the clothing being documented. Those are Pastor Whitfield's clothes. I remember them from church." "How do you remember them so specifically?" "I was an altar boy for 2 years. I saw Pastor Whitfield every Sunday. He always wore that same suit for evening services." Rodriguez studied David's face. "Your father buried these items here. Why?" "I don't know. Maybe he found them somewhere else. Maybe he was trying to help the investigation. Or maybe he was disposing of evidence after he killed Pastor Whitfield." David's face went pale. "You can't prove that. These clothes don't prove anything except that Dad found them somewhere." "Actually, they prove quite a lot," Rodriguez said, pulling out her phone to call the crime lab. "Forensic analysis will tell us whether these clothes were buried immediately after the disappearance or at some later date. If they were buried right away, it suggests your father was involved in the murder." The afternoon brought another breakthrough. Patricia Mills, the woman at the center of William Hartwell's accusations, returned Rodriguez's call from her home in Atlanta. "I've been dreading this conversation for 26 years, Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew someone would eventually want to talk to me about Pastor Whitfield. Mrs. Mills, we need to understand the nature of your relationship with the pastor. It was pastoral counseling, nothing more. I was going through a terrible divorce, and Pastor Whitfield was helping me cope. He was kind, supportive, and completely professional." "William Hartwell claimed there was something inappropriate about your relationship." Patricia's voice hardened. "William Hartwell was a vicious man who destroyed lives for sport. He took photographs of perfectly innocent meetings and twisted them into something sordid." "Tell me about these meetings." "Pastor Whitfield counseled me twice a week for about 3 months. We met at the church, at the hospital when my mother was dying, and once at the courthouse when I was filing divorce papers. That's it. Nothing inappropriate ever happened." Rodriguez made notes. "Did you know about Hartwell's accusations?" "Pastor Whitfield told me about them the week before he disappeared. He was heartbroken. He said William was trying to destroy his ministry and his family." "How did Pastor Whitfield seem in those final days?" "Determined but frightened. He said he was going to fight the accusations head-on, but he was worried about the damage to his family and the church." "Did he mention feeling threatened physically?" Patricia hesitated. "He said William had been following him, taking photographs, trying to catch him in compromising situations. He was concerned about what William might do if his accusations were proven false." The conversation continued for another hour, with Patricia providing detailed accounts of her interactions with both Pastor Whitfield and William Hartwell. Her testimony painted a picture of a dedicated pastor being systematically persecuted by a powerful church member. That evening, Rodriguez received a call from the crime lab. The forensic analysis of Pastor Whitfield's clothing had revealed several critical pieces of evidence. The clothes were buried within days of the disappearance, the technician reported. But more importantly, we found blood evidence on the shirt and jacket. The DNA confirms it's Pastor Whitfield's blood. Rodriguez felt a surge of excitement. How much blood? Enough to suggest significant trauma. The pattern indicates impact spatter, consistent with blunt force trauma to the head. Any other evidence? Soil samples from the clothes match the soil composition of the burial site. But we also found traces of motor oil, consistent with the oil found on the Bible. The pieces were falling into place. William Hartwell had killed Pastor Whitfield, buried his clothes on the family property, and disposed of the Bible in the well. But one crucial question remained. Where was the body? Rodriguez made a decision that would prove controversial. She requested a full excavation of the Hartwell property, including the area around the house and barn. If Pastor Whitfield's body was buried somewhere on the property, she was determined to find it. That night, she called Pastor Whitfield's son, Benjamin, to update him on the investigation. His reaction was immediate and emotional. 26 years, he said, his voice choked with emotion. 26 years of not knowing what happened to Dad. And now you're telling me he was murdered by someone he trusted. We're still gathering evidence, Rodriguez cautioned. But it's looking more and more like your father was the victim of a conspiracy. I want to be there when you find him, Benjamin said. I want to be there when you bring him home. As Rodriguez ended the call, she reflected on the human cost of the crimes they were investigating. A family had been destroyed, a congregation had been divided, and a community had lived with unanswered questions for more than 2 decades. But now, finally, the truth was beginning to emerge, and Rodriguez was determined to see that justice was served, no matter how long it took. The second day of excavation brought unseasonably cool weather and intermittent rain, creating muddy conditions that slowed the forensic team's progress. Detective Rodriguez stood under a canvas shelter, reviewing the evidence collected so far while waiting for the next phase of the search. Dr. Sandra Walsh approached with a grim expression. "We found something else," she announced. "About 50 yards from where we found the clothing." Rodriguez followed her to a site near the old barn, where the excavation team had uncovered what appeared to be a second burial site. This time, the cadaver dog's reaction was much stronger, and the ground-penetrating radar showed a clear anomaly consistent with human remains. "The soil disturbance is significant," Dr. Walsh explained. "Someone dug a grave approximately 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide. The depth suggests they wanted to ensure the remains would stay buried." The excavation began immediately. Working with painstaking care, the team gradually removed layers of soil and debris. At 4 feet down, they encountered the first bones, a human skull showing clear signs of trauma. "Blunt force trauma to the left temporal region," Dr. Walsh observed, examining the skull through a magnifying glass. "The fracture pattern suggests a single powerful blow from a heavy object." Rodriguez felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. They had found Pastor Whitfield, but the evidence confirmed he had been murdered. How long has he been here? Based on the bone condition and the soil composition, I'd estimate 25 to 30 years. The time frame is consistent with the 1982 disappearance. The excavation continued for several more hours. The skeleton was largely intact, positioned in what appeared to be a hastily dug grave. More importantly, several personal items were found with the remains. "Wedding ring, Doctor," Walsh announced, holding up a simple gold band. "Engraved with JW and SW 1957 and Forever in Christ." Rodriguez photographed the ring carefully. "Jeremiah and Sarah Whitfield, married in 1957. And this," Dr. Walsh continued, lifting a small metal object from the grave. "A car key, looks like it's for a 1979 Ford." The key matched the description of Pastor Whitfield's missing station wagon. Rodriguez realized they now had physical evidence directly linking the remains to the missing pastor. But the most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. As the excavation team was preparing to remove the remains, David Hartwell appeared at the edge of the site. His face was ashen, and his hands were shaking. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely audible. "I can't live with this anymore." Rodriguez immediately called for backup and read David his rights. He waived his right to an attorney and agreed to provide a statement. "I was there," David said, sitting in the back of Rodriguez's patrol car. "I saw what happened." "You were 16 years old in 1982. What did you see?" "Dad called me out to the barn around midnight on May 15th. He said he needed help with something. When I got there, I saw—" David's voice trailed off. "What did you see?" "Pastor Whitfield was lying on the ground. There was blood everywhere. Dad was standing over him with a shovel." Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken. "What did your father tell you?" "He said Pastor Whitfield had threatened him, tried to attack him. He said it was self-defense, but I could tell Dad was lying." "What happened next?" "Dad made me help him bury the body. He said if I ever told anyone, we'd both go to prison. He said the community would never forgive us." "Why are you telling me this now?" David looked toward the excavation site where his father's victim was being recovered. "Because I've carried this secret for 26 years, and it's destroying me. My father was a murderer, and I helped him cover it up." The confession provided the final piece of the puzzle. Rodriguez now had physical evidence, witness testimony, and a confession that definitively solved the case. But she needed to understand the full scope of what had happened. "David, tell me exactly what occurred that night." Dad had been following Pastor Whitfield for weeks, taking photographs, trying to catch him doing something wrong. That Saturday night, he saw the pastor leaving the church late and followed him home. Then what? Dad confronted Pastor Whitfield in the church parking lot. They argued about the accusations, about the church board meeting. Dad demanded that the pastor resign and leave town. How did the argument escalate? Pastor Whitfield refused to be intimidated. He said he was going to expose Dad's lies at the board meeting. Dad lost his temper and hit him with a tire iron from his truck. Rodriguez made detailed notes of David's confession. "Where did this confrontation take place?" "Behind the church, where Mrs. Stevens saw Dad's truck. Pastor Whitfield was unconscious but still breathing when Dad loaded him into the truck." "Your father brought him to the farm?" "Yes. Dad thought maybe the pastor would die naturally from the head injury, and he could make it look like an accident. But Pastor Whitfield regained consciousness in the barn." "What happened then?" David's voice broke. "Dad panicked. He said he couldn't let the pastor identify him. He hit him again with the shovel. That's when I arrived." The confession continued for another hour, with David providing detailed accounts of how his father had disposed of the evidence. The clothes were buried immediately, but William Hartwell had kept the Bible for several days before finally throwing it in the well. Why did he keep the Bible? "I think it was a trophy. Dad always said Pastor Whitfield was a hypocrite who didn't deserve to carry God's word. Keeping the Bible was his way of proving he was right." Rodriguez felt a deep sense of satisfaction as the confession concluded. The case was solved, but the human cost was enormous. David Hartwell would face charges as an accessory after the fact, and his life would never be the same. That evening, Rodriguez called the Whitfield family to inform them of the discovery. The conversation with Benjamin and Rebecca was emotional and cathartic. "We can finally lay him to rest," Rebecca said through tears. "We can finally say goodbye. More importantly," Benjamin added, "we know the truth. Dad didn't abandon us. He was murdered by someone who couldn't stand his message of love and acceptance." The remains were transported to the state crime lab for complete forensic analysis, but the identity was already confirmed through dental records and personal items. Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield had been found after 26 years. As Rodriguez prepared her final report, she reflected on the case's significance. It wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about exposing a conspiracy that had poisoned a community for decades. William Hartwell's hatred had not only cost Pastor Whitfield his life, but had also destroyed his own family's legacy. The truth had finally emerged from the shadows where it had been hidden for so long. Justice would be served, even if it came 26 years too late. The news of Pastor Whitfield's discovery and David Hartwell's confession spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. By morning, the town square was filled with reporters, camera crews, and curious onlookers. Detective Rodriguez found herself at the center of a media storm that had transformed the quiet rural community into a national news story. 26 years of lies, she told the assembled press during a hastily arranged news conference. A respected pastor was murdered by someone he trusted, and the truth was buried along with his body. The revelation that David Hartwell had been involved in covering up the crime sent shockwaves through the community. Many residents had known David his entire life, watched him grow up, attend school, and take over the family farm. The idea that he had been hiding such a terrible secret was almost incomprehensible. But Rodriguez's investigation was far from over. David's confession had opened new avenues of inquiry, and she was determined to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy. "We need to interview everyone who was involved in the original investigation," she told Deputy Chief Brennan. "I want to know if anyone else knew what really happened." Their first stop was the home of former Sheriff Harold Brennan, the current Deputy Chief's father, and the man who had overseen the original investigation. At 78, Harold was still sharp and immediately understood the implications of the new evidence. "I always felt something was off about William Hartwell's behavior," he admitted, sitting in his study surrounded by decades of law enforcement memorabilia. "He was too eager to help, too quick to suggest that Pastor Whitfield had simply run away." "Did you suspect he was involved?" "I had my doubts, but I couldn't prove anything. William was a respected member of the community, and his alibi seemed solid. His wife and son both confirmed he was home that night." Rodriguez pulled out David's confession statement. "We now know that David was lying to protect his father. What about Agnes Hartwell?" Harold's expression darkened. "Agnes was completely devoted to William. She would have said anything to protect him. Did you ever search the Hartwell property?" "We did a cursory search with William's permission, but we were looking for signs that Pastor Whitfield had been there, not for buried evidence. William was very helpful, showed us around personally." "The perfect cover," Rodriguez observed. "He could control what you saw and where you looked." The interview with Harold Brennan revealed the limitations of the original investigation. Without modern forensic techniques and with limited resources, the small-town police force had been unable to uncover the truth about Pastor Whitfield's disappearance. Rodriguez's next challenge was dealing with the current members of Trinity Baptist Church. The revelation that their former pastor had been murdered by a longtime church member had created a crisis of faith for many congregants. Reverend Marcus Thompson called an emergency meeting for that evening. The church sanctuary was packed with members seeking answers and comfort. Rodriguez was asked to address the congregation and explain what had happened. Pastor Whitfield was murdered because he stood for principles that threatened certain people's power and privilege, she told the assembled crowd. He died because he believed in love, acceptance, and justice. The congregation's reaction was mixed. Some members were devastated by the news, while others expressed anger at having been deceived for so long. A few elderly members who had been present during the original controversy shared their memories of the tension between William Hartwell and Pastor Whitfield. "I always wondered why William was so determined to destroy Pastor Whitfield's reputation," said Margaret Foster, now in her 80s. "Now I understand he was trying to justify what he had done." But the most emotional moment came when Patricia Mills arrived unexpectedly from Atlanta. The woman who had been at the center of William Hartwell's accusations stood before the congregation and spoke the truth about her relationship with Pastor Whitfield. "He saved my life," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "I was going through the darkest period of my life, and Pastor Whitfield's counseling and support helped me survive. There was nothing inappropriate about our relationship. He was a man of God who helped someone in need." The congregation gave Patricia a standing ovation, finally putting to rest the rumors that had plagued the community for decades. Rodriguez spent the next 2 days interviewing other people who had been involved in the original church controversy. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. William Hartwell had conducted a systematic campaign to destroy Pastor Whitfield's reputation, using lies, manipulation, and manufactured evidence. Robert Chen provided additional documents showing how William had tried to manipulate the church board. He had a folder full of what he called evidence, Chen recalled. Photographs, witness statements, financial records, all designed to make Pastor Whitfield look guilty of something. What happened to this evidence after the disappearance? William claimed he had destroyed it out of respect for the pastor's memory, but I always suspected he had kept it as insurance. This led Rodriguez to request a search warrant for the Hartwell house. Despite David's cooperation, she wanted to conduct a thorough search for any remaining evidence. The search revealed William Hartwell's true nature. Hidden in a locked cabinet in the basement, investigators found a collection of documents related to his campaign against Pastor Whitfield. The file contained surveillance photographs, typed reports of the pastor's activities, and correspondence with other church members who opposed the pastor's progressive positions. But the most damning evidence was William's personal journal, which documented his growing obsession with destroying Pastor Whitfield. The entries showed a man consumed by hatred and jealousy, willing to go to any lengths to achieve his goal. May 10, 1982. The pastor thinks he's won, but he's underestimated me. I have enough evidence to destroy him completely. If he won't resign voluntarily, I'll give him no choice. May 14, 1982. Followed the pastor again tonight. He's becoming suspicious, but it's too late. The board meeting is scheduled for Monday, and I'll present evidence that will end his ministry forever. May 15, 1982. It's finished. The pastor will never trouble this church again. God's will has been done. The journal entries provided a chilling insight into William Hartwell's mindset in the days leading up to the murder. Rodriguez realized that the crime hadn't been a spontaneous act of violence, but a premeditated murder designed to silence someone who threatened William's power and worldview. The investigation also revealed the extent of William's influence in the community. He had been a member of the town council, the school board, and numerous civic organizations. His reputation as a pillar of the community had made him virtually untouchable. He was the kind of man who expected everyone to defer to his judgment, Rodriguez told reporters. When Pastor Whitfield refused to be intimidated, William saw it as a personal challenge that had to be eliminated. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Rodriguez reflected on the broader implications of the case. It wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about exposing how prejudice and hatred could corrupt even the most seemingly respectable institutions. The truth about Pastor Whitfield's murder had finally emerged, but the damage caused by 26 years of lies and deception would take much longer to heal. The community would have to confront uncomfortable truths about how they had been deceived and manipulated by someone they had trusted and respected. Justice was finally within reach, but Rodriguez knew that the real work of healing and reconciliation was just beginning. The formal confession took place in the interview room of the Cedar Ridge Police Department. David Hartwell sat across from Detective Rodriguez and Deputy Chief Brennan, his hands folded on the metal table, his face etched with the weight of decades of guilt. "I want to tell you everything," David said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Every detail of what happened that night and what we did afterward." Rodriguez activated the recording equipment. "David, you've been read your rights, and you've waived your right to an attorney, is that correct?" "Yes, I've lived with this secret for 26 years. I can't carry it anymore. Tell us about the night of May 15, 1982. David took a deep breath. Dad had been planning something for weeks. He had files, photographs, witness statements, everything he thought he needed to destroy Pastor Whitfield's reputation, but the church board meeting hadn't gone the way he expected. "What do you mean?" Dad thought the other board members would immediately turn against Pastor Whitfield when he presented his accusations. Instead, they questioned his evidence and demanded proof of his claims. Some of them accused Dad of having a personal vendetta. Rodriguez made notes as David continued. "How did your father react to this?" "He was furious. He came home that night ranting about how the church was being led astray, how Pastor Whitfield was corrupting the congregation. He said something had to be done." "What did he mean by that?" "I didn't know then. Dad had always been intense about church matters, but this was different. He was talking about Pastor Whitfield like he was an enemy that needed to be destroyed." David's voice began to crack as he recalled the events of that night. Around 10 o'clock, Dad got a phone call. Someone told him that Pastor Whitfield was at the church, working late on his sermon. Dad grabbed his keys and said he was going to settle things once and for all. "Did you go with him?" "No, I stayed home and went to bed, but around midnight Dad came back and woke me up. He was covered in blood and he was panicking." Rodriguez leaned forward. "What did he tell you?" "He said there had been an accident. He said Pastor Whitfield had attacked him when he tried to confront him about the accusations. Dad claimed it was self-defense, but I could tell he was lying." "How could you tell?" "Dad was a hunter. He'd been in fights before. He knew how to defend himself without killing someone. But Pastor Whitfield was a gentle man, a scholar. He wouldn't have attacked anyone." David described how his father had forced him to help dispose of the body. Dad said, "If anyone found out what had happened, we'd both go to prison. He said the community would never forgive us and our family would be destroyed." "So you helped him bury the body?" "I was 16 years old and I was terrified. Dad was the strongest man I knew and he was completely out of control. I thought if I didn't help him, he might kill me too." The confession continued for 3 hours, with David providing detailed accounts of how they had buried Pastor Whitfield's body, disposed of his clothes, and created false alibis for that night. Dad made me promise to never tell anyone what had happened. He said it was our secret, and if I ever betrayed him, it would destroy our family and everything we'd worked for. How did you live with this secret for 26 years? David's composure finally broke. I didn't live with it. It destroyed me. I've never been able to have a normal relationship, never been able to trust anyone. Every day I woke up knowing I was an accessory to murder. Why didn't you come forward earlier? Dad was still alive until 1995. I was terrified of what he might do if I talked. After he died, I thought about it. But so much time had passed. I convinced myself that bringing it up would only cause more pain. Rodriguez studied David's face. What changed your mind? Finding that Bible in the well, seeing Pastor Whitfield's children on the news still searching for answers after all these years. I realized that my silence was causing more harm than the truth ever could. The confession was corroborated by physical evidence and witness statements. The forensic analysis of Pastor Whitfield's remains showed injuries consistent with David's account, and the discovery of William Hartwell's journal provided additional confirmation of the premeditated nature of the crime. But Rodriguez's investigation revealed that the conspiracy had been even broader than initially suspected. William Hartwell had recruited several other church members to help him build his case against Pastor Whitfield, and some of them had provided false testimony and fabricated evidence. We need to interview everyone who was involved in the original campaign against Pastor Whitfield, Rodriguez told Brennan. Some of these people may have known more than they admitted. The investigation revealed that at least 3 other church members had been actively involved in William Hartwell's conspiracy. They had provided false witness statements, helped stage compromising photographs, and spread rumors designed to damage Pastor Whitfield's reputation. However, none of them had known about the murder. Their involvement had been limited to the character assassination campaign that preceded the killing. They thought they were protecting the church, Rodriguez explained to reporters. They believed William Hartwell's lies about Pastor Whitfield and thought they were doing God's work by helping to expose him. The legal consequences for David Hartwell were severe, but not as harsh as they might have been. Given his cooperation with the investigation and the fact that he had been a minor at the time of the crime, prosecutors agreed to a plea bargain. David was sentenced to 5 years in prison for accessory after the fact to murder and obstruction of justice. He also agreed to testify against any other individuals who might be charged in connection with the case. I accept full responsibility for my actions, David said during his sentencing hearing. I should have come forward years ago. I should have told the truth about what my father did. The sentencing brought closure for the Whitfield family, but it also marked the beginning of a long healing process for the community. The revelation that one of their most respected citizens had been a murderer forced Cedar Ridge to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and the dangers of blind faith in authority figures. This case shows how hatred and prejudice can corrupt even the most seemingly righteous institutions, Rodriguez told the gathered media. William Hartwell used his position as a church leader to destroy an innocent man, and the community's trust in his authority allowed him to get away with murder for 26 years. The investigation had taken less than 2 weeks, but it had uncovered a conspiracy that had poisoned Cedar Ridge for decades. The truth about Pastor Whitfield's murder was finally known, but the work of healing and reconciliation would take much longer. As Rodriguez prepared to close the case, she reflected on the human cost of the crimes she had investigated. A dedicated pastor had been murdered, a family had been destroyed, and a community had been living with lies for more than a quarter of a century. But the truth had finally emerged, and justice, however delayed, was finally being served. The interrogation room at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation field office in Nashville was sterile and intimidating, designed to break down the defenses of even the most hardened criminals. Frank Morrison, now 71 and suffering from emphysema, sat hunched over the metal table, his oxygen tank humming quietly beside his chair. "Mr. Morrison," Detective Rodriguez began, "we have evidence that you provided false testimony against Pastor Whitfield in 1982. We need to know the extent of your involvement in William Hartwell's conspiracy." Morrison's weathered hands shook as he reached for his oxygen mask. After taking several deep breaths, he looked up at Rodriguez with eyes that held decades of guilt. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," he wheezed. "William said we were protecting the church from scandal. He said Pastor Whitfield was leading the congregation astray." What specifically did William ask you to do? He wanted me to sign a statement saying I had seen Pastor Whitfield in compromising situations with Patricia Mills. He said other people had seen the same things, and we needed to come forward to save the church. Rodriguez consulted her notes. But you never actually saw anything inappropriate, did you? Morrison's shoulders sagged. No. I saw them talking after church services, maybe walking together to the parking lot. Nothing more than that. But William convinced me that what I was seeing was just the tip of the iceberg. How did he convince you? He showed me photographs. Pastor Whitfield and Patricia Mills at various locations around town. William said they were meeting secretly, that their relationship was inappropriate for a married pastor. Did you believe him? I wanted to believe him. Pastor Whitfield's sermons about integration and social justice made me uncomfortable. I thought maybe he was compromising his ministry in other ways too. The interview continued for 2 hours, with Morrison providing detailed accounts of how William Hartwell had recruited him and others to build a case against Pastor Whitfield. The conspiracy had been more extensive than Rodriguez had initially realized. William had a list of people he thought would be sympathetic to his cause, Morrison explained. People who disagreed with Pastor Whitfield's progressive positions, who felt threatened by the changes he was making to the church. Who else was on this list? Helen Burke, Thomas Wright, Samuel Adams, and maybe 5 or 6 others. William approached each of us separately, told us we were the only ones who could save the church. Rodriguez made notes. What happened after you signed the false statement? William said he would handle everything. He said we just needed to be prepared to testify if it came to that. He made it sound like we were heroes, standing up for traditional values. Did you know that William was planning to kill Pastor Whitfield? Morrison's eyes widened in horror. God, no. If I had known, I never would have been involved. I thought we were just trying to force him to resign. The pattern was consistent across all the interviews Rodriguez conducted. William Hartwell had systematically recruited church members who disagreed with Pastor Whitfield's progressive positions, convincing them that they were participating in a righteous cause to save their church. Helen Burke, now 78 and living in a nursing home, broke down completely when confronted with the evidence. I've been carrying this guilt for 26 years, she sobbed. I knew what we were doing was wrong, but William made it seem like we had no choice. What did William tell you about Pastor Whitfield? He said the pastor was having an affair, that he was stealing money from the church, that he was planning to destroy everything we had built. He made it sound like Pastor Whitfield was the devil himself. Did you ever question his accusations? I tried to, but William always had answers. He had documents, photographs, witness statements. He made it seem like there was overwhelming evidence. Rodriguez realized that William Hartwell had been a master manipulator, using people's fears and prejudices to turn them against Pastor Whitfield. He had created an echo chamber of false accusations that reinforced each other and made the lies seem credible. Thomas Wright, the only other surviving member of the original conspiracy, provided the most damning testimony. William told me that Pastor Whitfield was a communist sympathizer who was trying to destroy the church from within, he said during his interview. He said we had to stop him before he corrupted the entire congregation. Did you believe these accusations? I wanted to believe them. Pastor Whitfield's sermons about civil rights and social justice scared me. I thought maybe he was part of some larger conspiracy to destroy traditional values. What role did you play in the conspiracy? I helped William spread rumors, provided false testimony, and recruited other church members to join the cause. I thought I was doing God's work. The interviews revealed the full scope of William Hartwell's conspiracy. He had recruited at least 8 church members to provide false testimony, fabricated evidence, and spread rumors designed to destroy Pastor Whitfield's reputation. More disturbing was the discovery that the conspiracy had continued even after Pastor Whitfield's murder. Several of the conspirators had helped spread the narrative that the pastor had simply run away, abandoning his family and his calling. William told us that Pastor Whitfield's disappearance proved his guilt, Helen Burke explained. He said an innocent man would have stayed to fight the accusations, but a guilty man would run away. Rodriguez realized that this post-murder conspiracy had been crucial in preventing the truth from emerging. By controlling the narrative and reinforcing the idea that Pastor Whitfield had simply abandoned his family, William Hartwell had successfully deflected suspicion from himself. The investigation also revealed that William Hartwell had used his position as a church leader to gather intelligence on other members of the congregation. He had kept detailed files on church members, documenting their personal lives, financial situations, and political beliefs. He was like a small-town J. Edgar Hoover, Rodriguez observed to Deputy Chief Brennan. He used information as a weapon to control and manipulate people. The files discovered during the search of the Hartwell house showed the extent of William's surveillance activities. He had been monitoring the activities of church members for years, looking for anything that could be used to maintain his power and influence. The legal consequences for the surviving conspirators were limited by the passage of time and the fact that they had not been directly involved in the murder. However, several of them faced charges for perjury and obstruction of justice. These people were manipulated and deceived, Rodriguez told reporters, but they also made choices that contributed to a terrible injustice. They need to face the consequences of those choices. The revelation of the conspiracy's full scope had a profound impact on the Cedar Ridge community. Many residents were shocked to learn that people they had known and trusted for decades had been involved in a systematic campaign of lies and deception. "It makes you question everything you thought you knew about people," said Margaret Foster, one of the few church members who had supported Pastor Whitfield throughout the controversy. "How do you trust anyone after something like this?" The investigation had revealed not just a murder, but a comprehensive conspiracy that had corrupted an entire community. The truth about Pastor Whitfield's death was finally known, but the damage caused by 26 years of lies would take much longer to repair. As Rodriguez prepared to close the case, she reflected on the broader implications of what she had uncovered. The conspiracy against Pastor Whitfield had been successful not because of any single act of evil, but because of the willingness of ordinary people to be complicit in injustice. This case shows how dangerous it can be when people allow fear and prejudice to override their moral judgment, she told the assembled media. The real tragedy is that so many people knew something was wrong, but they chose to remain silent rather than speak the truth. The investigation had taken 3 weeks, but it had uncovered a conspiracy that had shaped Cedar Ridge for nearly 3 decades. The truth was finally known, but the work of healing and reconciliation was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Cedar Ridge Cemetery as hundreds of mourners gathered for the funeral of Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield. 26 years after his disappearance, the community was finally able to lay him to rest with the dignity and honor he deserved. Benjamin Whitfield, now 34, stood at the graveside holding his 3-year-old daughter, Emma. Beside him, his sister Rebecca clutched a bouquet of white roses, their father's favorite flowers. After more than 2 decades of uncertainty and grief, the family was finally able to say goodbye. "Today we not only mourn the loss of a great man," said Reverend Marcus Thompson, addressing the assembled crowd, "but we also celebrate the truth that has finally set us free." Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield was a man of God who died for his principles, and his legacy will live on in the hearts of all who knew him. The funeral service was held at Trinity Baptist Church, the same building where Pastor Whitfield had preached for nearly 20 years. The sanctuary was packed with current and former members of the congregation, many of whom had made the journey from across the country to pay their respects. Detective Rodriguez stood near the back of the church, watching as the community came together to honor the man whose murder she had finally solved. The investigation had consumed her life for nearly a month, but seeing the closure it had brought to the Whitfield family made every hour worthwhile. Patricia Mills had flown in from Atlanta to attend the service. Now in her early 60s, she bore the marks of a life well lived, but her eyes still held the pain of the false accusations that had haunted her for decades. "Pastor Whitfield saved my life," she said during the service, her voice strong and clear. "He showed me the love of God when I needed it most, and he died because he refused to compromise his principles. He was a true shepherd who gave his life for his flock." The service included testimonies from many of the church members who had been served by Pastor Whitfield's ministry. They spoke of his compassion, his dedication to justice, and his unwavering commitment to the gospel message of love and acceptance. "He taught us that faith without works is dead," said Eleanor Haskins, now 82 and still sharp despite her age. "He showed us that being a Christian means standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous." The legal proceedings related to the case were nearing completion. David Hartwell had been sentenced to 5 years in prison and was serving his time at the Tennessee State Prison. Several of the surviving conspirators had received probation and community service sentences for their roles in the cover-up. More importantly, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation had launched a comprehensive review of unsolved cases from the 1980s, looking for other crimes that might have been overlooked due to the limitations of that era's investigative techniques. This case has taught us valuable lessons about the importance of persistent investigation and the dangers of accepting easy explanations, said TBI Director Sarah Mitchell during a press conference. We're committed to reviewing other cold cases with the same thoroughness that Detective Rodriguez brought to this investigation. The impact of the case extended far beyond Cedar Ridge. Churches across the country had begun examining their own histories, looking for signs of abuse of power or corruption that might have been overlooked or covered up. The Whitfield case shows how important it is to have accountability and transparency in all our institutions, said Dr. James Patterson, a professor of church history at Vanderbilt University. It's a reminder that even the most seemingly righteous people can be corrupted by power and prejudice. The Trinity Baptist Church had established the Jeremiah Whitfield Foundation, dedicated to supporting social justice causes and providing assistance to families of missing persons. The foundation's first project was funding a scholarship program for students pursuing careers in law enforcement or social work. Dad always believed that education was the key to fighting injustice, Benjamin Whitfield said during the foundation's launch ceremony. This scholarship program will help ensure that his message of love and justice continues to make a difference in the world. The investigation had also led to significant improvements in police investigative procedures. The Cedar Ridge Police Department had implemented new protocols for cold case investigations and had established partnerships with state and federal agencies to ensure that future cases would receive the resources they needed. "We can't change what happened in 1982, said Police Chief Maria Santos, who had been promoted following the successful resolution of the Whitfield case, but we can make sure that our department is equipped to handle similar cases in the future. The community healing process was slow but steady. The Cedar Ridge City Council had established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to help residents process the revelations about the conspiracy and its impact on the community. We have to acknowledge that our community was divided by hatred and prejudice, said Mayor Robert Chen, the son of the former church board member who had defended Pastor Whitfield. But we also have to recognize that truth and justice have finally prevailed. The commission had organized several public forums where residents could share their memories of Pastor Whitfield and discuss the lessons learned from the case. The sessions were emotionally difficult, but ultimately healing for many participants. "I spent 26 years believing that Pastor Whitfield had abandoned us," said former church member Linda Murphy. "Now I know that he was murdered because he stood up for what was right. That knowledge is painful, but it's also inspiring." The case had also prompted a broader discussion about the role of religion in social justice movements. Pastor Whitfield's progressive positions, which had been controversial in 1982, were now seen as prophetic by many observers. Pastor Whitfield was ahead of his time, said Dr. Martin King III, son of the civil rights leader, who spoke at a memorial service in Nashville. He understood that the gospel message demands action on behalf of justice and equality. His death was a tragedy, but his legacy continues to inspire people to fight for what's right. As the anniversary of the case's resolution approached, Detective Rodriguez reflected on the investigation that had consumed her life for nearly a month. The truth about Pastor Whitfield's murder had finally been revealed, but the broader lessons about power, prejudice, and the importance of speaking truth to authority would resonate for years to come. "This case taught me that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied," she said during a speech at the State Police Academy. "Sometimes the truth takes decades to emerge, but it's our job as law enforcement officers to never stop searching for it." The Whitfield family had found peace in the knowledge that their father and husband had been vindicated. The false accusations that had haunted them for decades had been exposed as lies, and Pastor Whitfield's reputation had been restored. "Dad always told us that the truth would set us free," Rebecca Whitfield said during the final memorial service. "It took 26 years, but he was right. We're finally free from the questions and doubts that have haunted us for so long." As the sun set over Cedar Ridge on the anniversary of the case's resolution, the community gathered in the town square for a candlelight vigil. The event was a celebration of truth, justice, and the power of persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield died for his principles, Detective Rodriguez told the assembled crowd. But his death was not in vain. The truth about his murder has exposed a conspiracy of hatred and prejudice, and that exposure has made our community stronger and more committed to justice. The vigil concluded with a moment of silence for Pastor Whitfield and all victims of injustice who had been forgotten or ignored. As the candles flickered in the evening breeze, the residents of Cedar Ridge committed themselves to ensuring that such a tragedy would never happen again. The case of Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield was closed, but its impact would continue to resonate for generations. The truth had finally emerged from the shadows where it had been hidden for 26 years, bringing justice to the victim and closure to his family. Most importantly, the case had demonstrated that even the most powerful conspiracies cannot ultimately suppress the truth. With patience, persistence, and dedication to justice, even the oldest and most carefully hidden secrets can be brought to light. The shepherd had finally come home, and his flock could rest in peace, knowing that justice had been served. The end. Author's note. This story is a work of fiction inspired by true crime investigations. While the characters and events are fictional, the investigative techniques and legal procedures described are based on actual law enforcement practices. The themes of power, prejudice, and the importance of speaking truth to authority are unfortunately all too real in many communities. Final word count, 103,247 characters.